Hello, it's Lord Slar here, and today we are talking about the Evil of the Daleks animation, which released last week. So, I was very impressed with this animation, which is by the same group of people who did the Power of the Daleks, the Macra Terror, and the Faceless ones. Three animations that kind of got progressively better as they went along, with Power of the Daleks looking a bit rushed and feeling as if there was, even though it was a functional animation, it's still, I'd argue, better than watching the reconstruction. It had a few issues, but when we got onto the Macater and the Faces ones as they had more time, it kept getting better, and this one continues that trend, fortunately, because obviously Fury from the Deep and the Web of Fear, the other two animations that have been done before this one, were by a different group, were by Big Finish Interactive. So let's talk about this animation first, before we kind of move on to a little bit of a discussion of the story. So the first thing I wanted to really compliment is the great character models. All of the characters look really good. They look like who they represent. There's a lot of detail there. Obviously, some details aren't possible, like obviously Barry Troughton's trousers still don't have the checkered thing because that would be too difficult to animate. But in general, I think there is a kind of still a further step up from the quality we saw in the Faces ones, which is perhaps to do with the fact that the costumes in the original of the story that Evil Daleks Collect the Faces ones did have more exciting costumes because there was a bit of a period piece element to it. There's some of the characters I'm still not sure about, like for example Jamie still has that kind of really old looking face when obviously he's meant to be very young, and I don't know, I wish they'd kind of change that because that's kind of been a problem with the last two animations this studio have done for me. Although I think they've improved on Patrick Troughton's face, who looked a bit too fresh-faced in the previous ones. It's almost like they swapped around Jamie and the second Doctor's face in the sense that Jamie looked a bit more grizzled and Patrick Troughton's Doctor was looking too kind of baby-faced. But I feel they've improved that now, and I'm happy with his face at this point, which I know that's a very minor nitpick, but you're watching the Lord Slar YouTube channel. Minor nitpicks are kind of my thing. And I think another thing to talk about is how exceptional the Dalek models look. So if you remember back to the Power of the Daleks, even though there was a bit of kind of stilted animation throughout, one thing that was uniformly praised was how great the Daleks looked, because obviously it's quite easy to do that kind of 3D model with the Daleks because of the nature of them. They're quite static. You don't need to animate them to look like a person because they do move quite robotically in the show and look quite robotic. And they've improved on this even further. The Dalek models just look great. They're even smoother, they're more detailed, they just pop out of the screen, but in the best of ways. They look imposing, and they even managed to do some impressive things within the animation. Like, for example, there's a scene in the original where the Dalek knocks Maxtable to the floor with his sucker plunger. Obviously, a scene that would be very easy to look silly, and obviously we don't have the original footage, but I get the feeling it probably did look silly in the original footage. But in the animation, it actually looks really cool, because of the camera angle they filmed at, and also the benefits of what you can do with animation. It does look quite intimidating when that happens, which I imagine isn't the easiest thing to have done. And speaking again about the kind of detail in this animation, the sets just look amazing, especially in the kind of Victorian house, which I imagine this has been one of the more difficult animations to do that in, because we think about all the ones they've done so far, they've been kind of more sci-fi stories, set in kind of futuristic kind of times. Obviously with the exception of the Faceless ones. But that was set in an airport, which didn't need as much detail, because if we think about these kind of more sci-fi stories, and including the Faceless ones, we have these backgrounds that are quite matte, flat, not a whole lot of detail in them, because obviously it's difficult to come up with the kind of budget as well as the imagination back then, given what the resources they had to work with to really have something that pops out, so that makes it a lot easier to animate. Whereas with a period piece, well, that's cheap for the BBC to make, because the BBC famously done lots of period pieces for all sorts of periods, so all of the kind of costumes and backgrounds for the sets, that's all kind of in the storage wardrobe, which means there's incredibly detailed backgrounds in this story, and they managed to do it justice in Maxtable's house. It does look really good. I didn't notice much of a quality drop from how the backgrounds looked in the surviving episode, episode 2, to how they looked in the next animated episode, episode 3, which takes place almost entirely in the house. So I just wanted to really praise that. And I think another thing they've got a lot better at in this animation is there are much more smooth action scenes. They're not perfect, and they still do look a bit stilted in places, but you know, we've got to bear in mind the budget of these animations, and the fact that really, given it's quite a niche thing, we're lucky to be getting any kind of animation, let alone one of this quality. So I'm happy with how the action scenes are now, because in a lot of previous ones, they looked really bad. Not just the action scenes, but in terms of just the movement as well. Especially in Power of the Daleks, there was some really bad movement in some of the scenes, in that animation. Whereas in this one, they've improved on that a lot. And there's like a sword fight, which goes on for about 2 minutes of screen time in episode 5, I think. And that actually looks pretty good. A little stilted, but given the animation technique they're doing, trying to replicate, what happened on television, which isn't an easy thing to do, I felt that they did a really good job. And I didn't feel like I was being taken out of the story at all by any of the kind of animation stuff. It didn't feel like any of it was jarring enough where I thought, ooh, okay, that kind of took me out of the atmosphere, which has happened in some of the previous animations, but definitely didn't in this one. So, yeah, basically it's a very good animation. I think now we're going to just move on, have a little bit of discussion of the story. So I've already done a very in-depth review of Evil of the Daleks, which is in my Season 4 review video, so go check that out if you want a much more in-depth opinion, especially while I talk about the story's main issue, which is the plot holes. However, the animation can't really do anything to address the plot holes, so I am actually going to talk about something that the animation does kind of help, but is still a big issue. So in this story, it's 7 episodes long, there's about 3 different sections, almost 3 acts, I suppose you could say. It starts off with the Doctor and Jamie trying to find out where the TARDIS has gone. They're kind of lured into Waterhouse's, Waterfield's shop to take them back to Maxtable's house where the Daleks are. Acting under orders of the Daleks. That's the first part, and it's kind of this almost tense espionage, not quite espionage, but you know what I mean, kind of detective mystery kind of thing going on there. And then we get to the house where they have the Daleks, and then there's the big experiment that goes on with the Doctor testing Jamie to make the human factor. And then after that we have the third part, which is entirely set on Skaro and is about the kind of Dalek revolution that happens. So my issue with this is that, well, there's a couple of reasons. Essentially, the transition between each of the parts is not very good. So when we look at the kind of first part, and that kind of ends in the middle of episode 2, we then transition to Maxtable's house, and the experiment doesn't really start for about 15 minutes of screen time, and in that time there's kind of stuff that doesn't really matter, like Jamie gets kidnapped and then rescued pretty much instantly, and it does really feel like filler. And obviously I'm an ardent defender of the longer classic Doctor Who stories, as I'm sure you all know, but this is a case where, yeah, maybe 6 episodes would have been more appropriate, because this doesn't just happen here, but also after the experiments are done. They also piss about for about an episode, just with this side character, Tyrrell, who seems to go through this weird Dalek kind of control arc, but it doesn't really contribute to the story at all. And even though there's stuff going on, it feels like we're kind of stuck in limbo between the middle part of the story and the end part of the story, and it's just like, come on, let's just get onto Skaro. We finished here. We finished this bit of the story. There's nothing left to be doing. Why are we pissing about here? And so that was something when I was watching the reconstruction I was really annoyed by, and part of what kind of dragged the story down. And don't get me wrong, I still love the story, but that was something that was a big issue for me. And the animation does actually improve this, as getting to kind of see this stuff moving helps a lot, because obviously just staring at a still image while nothing's going on is not as fun as just seeing the characters actually move. And also there's some action scenes, like the sword fight I was talking about takes place in that kind of lull between part 2 of the story and part 3 of the story, act 2 and act 3. There's a sword fight in that, and actually getting to see that actually was like, oh, okay, well, I feel the stakes are a bit higher here. I'm enjoying this much more now that I can actually see some motion here. So it does improve it, but I'd still say it's a big problem. So to conclude, this is an excellent animation, and it's definitely the best of the modern Doctor Who animations. My favourite overall is still going to be the Moonbase, because they went for that really fluid style, which just isn't really possible to do on the budget they have when you've got 6-7 episodes to animate. And so that was obviously going to be, I think that's always going to be the best one, really, the Moonbase, unless they come up with some revolutionary new technique that's quite cheap. But it's definitely the best of the newer ones, and I'm glad this animation team is just keeps on showing progression and getting better. And I'm really looking forward to what they do next, which one they animate next. As for Big Finish Interactive, who are doing the other animations, well, I'm still quite skeptical of them, because obviously did View from the Deep, which I wasn't a fan of. And then also we had the Web of Fear one, which I just outright refused to buy, because it looks awful. Absolutely dreadful. So let's hope they improve with the Galaxy 4 animation, which I'm actually going to go to the BFI to see. But yes, if you haven't got the Power Daleks animation yet, get it. It's a brilliant story, and the animation does it justice. So thank you for watching, and I'll see you back next time in another video.